The radio crackled. Unit 5, respond to a motor vehicle accident. Single occupant, trapped, conscious but unstable. Logan Reed straightened in his seat. His heart rate didn't spike, not yet. After 10 years as a paramedic, he had conditioned himself not to react too early. Wait until you get eyes on the scene. That was the rule. Never assume the worst. His partner, Mason, clicked on the siren, flipping a switch to bathe the dark streets in pulsing red and blue. "How bad do you think?" Mason asked, accelerating through an intersection. Logan exhaled. "If they're conscious, we've got time." But he knew that meant nothing. Sometimes people were awake, fully alert, even joking, and then they died minutes later. Other times, they found patients barely clinging to life and managed to pull them back from the brink. You never knew which way the dice would fall. Tonight, he was about to roll snake eyes. They reached the scene in less than 4 minutes. The flashing strobes from police cars painted the asphalt in a surreal, stuttering glow. And then Logan saw the wreck. It wasn't just a crash. It was a nightmare of twisted steel and broken glass. A black sedan had slammed into a concrete barrier. The front end crumpled inward like an accordion. The driver's side was crushed, the door bent inward so deep that the woman inside was pinned against the wheel. She was awake. Her chest rose and fell erratically, her breath hitching in short, frantic gasps. Blood streaked down her forehead, matting in blonde hair. Her hands trembled violently as she tried to move, but she was trapped. Logan saw the sheer terror in her wide, unfocused eyes. That was the moment he knew. This girl wasn't going to make it. He had seen that look before, that silent, desperate pleading, that subconscious understanding of fate, the one that came just before a body shut down for good. And yet, she still clung to hope. As soon as Logan knelt beside the broken window, her eyes snapped to him, locking on like he was the only thing anchoring her to reality. "Am I going to be okay?" Logan hesitated for half a second. He had 2 choices. Tell her the truth. Tell her that her body was failing, that the chances of her making it out of this alive were slim at best, that she should use her last moments to say whatever she needed to say. Or he could lie. He forced a steady breath, locked his expression into one of calm control, and reached through the shattered window, placing a gloved hand over her trembling one. "Yeah," he said, his voice even. "You're gonna be okay." The words tasted like ash in his mouth, but it was what she needed to hear. Her panicked breathing slowed slightly, her fingers tightening around his. That was what mattered, keeping her calm, keeping her hopeful. Because the alternative was letting her die in fear. The fire crew was already setting up the jaws of life, preparing to cut her free. But Logan saw the real problem immediately. Her legs were pinned beneath the dashboard, her abdomen compressed into the wheel. The human body was a fragile machine, and right now, hers was crushing itself from the inside out. The moment they pulled her free, the pressure would release, and she would bleed out in minutes. She had massive internal trauma, and there was nothing they could do about it. He could already see the signs, the paling skin, the rapid pulse, the sweat beading along her hairline despite the cold air. She was bleeding out right now. He just had to make sure she didn't know it. "What's your name?" he asked, voice calm. Her lips trembled. "Emily. Emily, I'm Logan. I'm a paramedic. We're getting you out of here, okay?" Her blue eyes flickered with something close to hope. "I can't move my legs." Logan swallowed. "That's okay. That's just the adrenaline kicking in. You're gonna feel better once we get you to the hospital." "Lieutenant." He could feel Mason's gaze on him. His partner knew what was happening. Mason knew she wasn't going to make it, and yet Logan still found himself gripping her hand tighter. She still believed him. "She's going critical," Mason muttered under his breath. Logan didn't respond. The metal groaned and screamed as the firefighters began cutting the car open. Sparks flew, the acrid smell of burning paint and oil thick in the air. Emily winced in pain, her body barely able to move under the weight of the crash. Her free hand twitched against her stomach, and Logan noticed the first streaks of red seeping through her hoodie. The internal bleeding was worsening. "We don't have time." "Emily," Logan said, forcing himself to keep his voice gentle, steady, controlled. "I need you to keep talking to me, okay?" She nodded weakly. I have a dog at home. His name's Cooper." "That's a good name," Logan said, keeping pressure on her wound. pretending like it would actually help. What kind of dog? Golden Retriever, her voice wavered. He's gonna be so excited when I come home. Logan's throat tightened painfully. He opened his mouth, wanted to say something, anything, but Mason's hand clapped onto his shoulder. The moment they move that dash, she's gonna crash. Logan knew, but Emily was still looking at him, still waiting for reassurance, for the lie. He took a deep breath and gave her one last smile. You'll see him soon, Emily, I promise. The moment the dashboard lifted, Emily's body lurched forward and the monitor clipped to her shattered wrist let out a single, deafening alarm. Flatline. Shit, she's crashing, Mason barked. Logan knew this would happen. The wreckage had been the only thing keeping her alive. The pressure from the crushed metal had acted like a tourniquet, holding everything in place. But now, with the weight lifted, her ruptured arteries were free to bleed, and she was bleeding fast. Get her on the stretcher! Move! Move! Logan barked, grabbing the bag valve mask and squeezing air into her lungs as the firefighters hoisted her onto the stretcher. She was barely conscious. Her eyes fluttered, pupils blown wide, her lips murmuring something. Logan leaned in, straining to hear. Cooper, her dog, the one she thought she was going home to. His hands shook, but he didn't stop, didn't let himself stop, as they rushed her toward the ambulance. They sped toward the hospital at full throttle, sirens screaming into the night. Logan pumped the ambu bag, forcing air into her collapsing lungs. Mason worked furiously beside him, pushing epinephrine, adjusting the IV flow, doing everything they could to keep her failing body alive. But Logan already knew. She wasn't coming back. Her skin was gray now, lips tinged with blue, and her body was fighting against itself. But she was still awake, still aware. And she was looking at him. Her fingers trembled, reaching for his hand, and she whispered one last thing. Thank you? Then she was gone. The monitor let out a long, unbroken tone. Flatline. Logan pressed 2 fingers to her cooling neck, waiting, praying for a pulse. Nothing. His hands clenched into fists, and for a moment, he just sat there. The ER doors burst open as they wheeled Emily inside. The doctors and nurses took over immediately, calling out orders, pressing paddles to her chest, injecting another round of meds. But it was over before it started. Time of death, 2:34 a.m. The room fell silent. Logan stepped back, his pulse pounding in his ears. He felt like he was underwater, like the world had been muted. He turned his gaze to Emily's lifeless form on the stretcher. Her eyes were closed now, peaceful, like she had never been terrified, like she had never fought for her life in his hands, like she hadn't died believing a lie. You'll see him soon, Emily. I promise. The words echoed in his skull, slamming against the inside of his mind. He had lied to her, because she wasn't going home. She was never going home. He turned on his heel and walked out. Back in the ambulance, Logan sat in the jump seat, staring at his blood-streaked gloves. His hands had stopped shaking. He felt nothing. Mason climbed into the driver's seat. You did everything you could, man. Logan didn't respond, because he hadn't done everything. He hadn't told her the truth. And now, that last moment, her hopeful eyes, the way she had clung to his words, was burned into his memory forever. He leaned back, exhaling shakily. Then he reached down and picked up the small, blood-stained blanket from the stretcher. He didn't know why he took it. Maybe because it was the last real thing left of her. Maybe because he needed to remember that sometimes the worst thing a paramedic could do was offer hope. Because sometimes hope was a lie.